There's the bell, and that means we're in session. Welcome to SC Charter Chatter, the only podcast dedicated to all charter schools in South Carolina. I'm your host, Kevin. Thank you for joining us. We are presented by the Public Charter School Alliance of South Carolina. Excited to be back with SC Charter Chatter, and we have a great episode and guest today. You know, every year, charter schools make positive strides in public education on the national level and here in the Palmetto State to bring educational options for students and families. A lot of that work starts with the National Alliance of Public Charter Schools. They work to advocate for more than 3.5 million students attending charter schools across the country, including the nearly 50,000 students we have attending charter schools here in our state. And today we're excited to have the president and CEO of the National Alliance of Public Charter Schools, Nina Rees. She's been leading the National Alliance since 2013, and she's been advocating for and working to improve education and educational choices since long before that. Nina, thank you for joining SC Charter Chatter.
Thank you so much for having me.
Your individual story is quite remarkable and unique. And I want to start today with that. For those who may not be familiar with your story, tell us how you got involved with charter schools and why you're such in education and then charter schools and why you're such a strong advocate and supporter for those schools.
Well, Kevin, first of all, thank you so much for having me. I have learned everything I know by working with state association leaders around the country. So to be part of this podcast and helping the charter sector in South Carolina learn a little bit more about our national activities is definitely something that I'm very proud of. And so thank you so much for giving me this opportunity. So in terms of my background, as you may know, I was born and raised in Iran, left Iran in 1983 when I was 14. And of all places, we moved to Blacksburg, Virginia, which is a small town in Southwest Virginia. And I was a high school student at the time. This is the only high school in Blacksburg. And, at the time, I didn't know any better. I kind of lived through those 2.5 years, and moved on to college. But in reflecting recently back onto some of the things that kind of have defined who I am today, certainly those 2 years were instructive in a sense, because I was certainly in a school that by all measures and standards was doing well academically in the state of Virginia. But for me, because English wasn't my first language and I was a student from another country, it definitely, wasn't a good fit, so to speak. So fast forward, when I moved to Washington, D.C. to work in public policy, I really didn't have a sense as to what area I was interested in. And I ended up working at a public interest law firm that advocated on behalf of low-income families who wanted access to better options, better schools. And by meeting these families and advocating with them, I discovered how much I enjoyed the topic and how much that their stories and the stories of their kids connected with my own story, both because obviously my family left Iran to give me and my brother an opportunity at a better life because of the quality of public schools in this country, which is, again, what most every family wants for their kids, but also because finding a school that really fits your needs is at the heart of your success. And in many of our, suburban and urban usually choice is discussed in the context of urban settings, which is where the need is highest. But I would argue that in suburban and rural communities, you have just as many students who are stuck in schools that are doing well by the average typical student who comes to their school, but they're probably not taking care of their, outliers or the rest of the students who are not the focus of attention. So that's one of the key reasons I'm motivated by this cause. And I definitely think that we're on the right side of history, certainly now after the pandemic, in advocating for greater public school options.
And I think you can probably say better than a lot of people that this really has been a lifelong work. I mean, you didn't know it at the time in high school or when you moved to Blacksburg, Virginia, but you were really already stepping into that role that you've kind of led into today.
Absolutely. And my story is similar to that of a lot of individuals out there. Everyone has gone to a school, has a story of a teacher who's motivated them and one who potentially hasn't motivated them. So, education is really at the heart of the American dream. And
Right.
Increasingly, it's not okay just to educate a handful of students and send them to college. We have to make sure every one of our kids is ready, not just to compete with the students who graduate from schools in this country, but on the global marketplace with other students, graduating from different countries. And, a lot of them, when you look at national or international testing scores and standards in countries like South Korea and China and some of these other countries, most of these students are outperforming US students. And so as the global marketplace shrinks, the need for our students to be competitive on that stage becomes even more important. And so it's not just about academic achievement, quite frankly, it's also about socio-emotional health and about, the other measures of success that I think increasingly our schools are also paying more attention to, thanks to the pandemic.
Right, like that right fit, which kind of leads me into where I was wanting to go next. And as we record this, we're celebrating National School Choice Week, a time when we celebrate educational options, of course, including our charter schools. So Nina, talk to us about, and I think you hit on it a little bit, but talk to us a little bit more about why that choice is so important for families and for students.
Yes. So happy School Choice Week. I should have launched with that. It's important on so many levels. I mean, no one in our society, we have options on so many levels when it comes to the type of childcare center we send our kids to. There are several options often available to families when it comes to higher education. My daughter is 16. We're about to take a road trip through the Northeast to look at different colleges and universities. So, choice is baked into a lot of our decisions in this country. We're not assigned to anything anymore, and having those options is important, but all the more important, as I said, because of the pandemic, because one of the things that a lot of families noticed is that the one-size-fits-all model that may have worked for their students before the pandemic hit was certainly not able to deliver the type of education that they needed for their students. So if you were in a school district where every school was closed, certainly, and you needed to make sure you had childcare to oversee your child doing schoolwork online, unless you had your own funding, you weren't able to tap into some of these things. So it ended up really taking a toll on families. For the first time, families were seeing what was being taught, in real time by watching their students getting educated. And they also started to look at other options. In many communities, as you know, they took advantage of hiring a teacher and creating a pod or getting their students access to other online supplemental work, math homework, and additional academic and more challenging coursework, which is certainly what a lot of affluent families did. So what happened in the past 2 years demonstrates the importance of options, but also kind of breaking what's being taught in school apart a little bit so that you can access different things and these supplemental courseworks on your own without having to just work with one system and one school and one module.
Totally agree completely with all of that. Nina, since we're still here early in 2022, I think we can still do this. I want to just take a quick moment here and take a look back. What do we do in 2021 in the way of victories for charter schools? Maybe, I know you're at the national scene, but nationally and at the state levels, locally as well. What do we see last year?
Well, on the school choice and charter school front, certainly it was a tremendous year because, first of all, in any community where there was some talk of choice and charters, the governors and elected officials of the states in question ended up doing something to move the needle forward. In states like Iowa, we saw dramatic improvements in the state's charter law. This is something we had been fighting for a long time. Iowa has one of the weakest laws, and thanks to the governor, we were able to enact some improvements that now put Iowa closer to the top of the stack in terms of charter school laws. And we just released our model law ranking report yesterday. So you'll see that Iowa made a huge jump ahead. The other thing we saw in states like Ohio, for instance, the governor passed a law that expands charters beyond certain jurisdictions where charters existed. So now you can open a charter school anywhere throughout the state. But we also saw something else which was interesting. In those instances where governors had control, well, every state received additional funds because of the pandemic relief efforts that started during the Trump years, but also were enhanced during President Biden's administration. So the federal government disseminated $13.5 billion in March of 2020 to help mitigate some of the risks and funding shortfalls that were caused by the pandemic. In December of 2020, they disseminated another $50 billion in funding. And then last March, an additional $121 billion was disseminated to states and school districts. Most of the money has gone to school districts, but some stayed with governors. And so we also have examples of governors that took advantage of those dollars to help charter schools. And I know that South Carolina was one of those states. So bottom line is that, because, again, these elected officials were seeing what parents were going through and charters were a viable public option, they looked to charter schools for solutions. And certainly the story of charter schools in terms of their response to the pandemic is an extremely positive one, as the state, the schools in your own state demonstrated.
Yes, we did see very good collaboration, especially like, for example, in South Carolina with our virtual schools, collaborating with the traditional districts and assisting them in teaching when they had to go virtual and things like that. So absolutely, our charters were helping lead the way in South Carolina. So we commend them for that, for sure. And as they do just about every day, leading the way for education and choice in South Carolina. So a natural follow-up to that question would be, what's ahead for charter schools, national level, even locally? What do we see coming down the pipeline?
Well, I think it's important to note, and I've been talking to a few charter leaders, that regardless of whether you're running a public or a charter or a private school, everyone will admit that the pandemic has had an impact on students, and both on their learning, but also on their socio-emotional health. And I think if you're an educator, you're woefully aware of a lot of the gaps that were there before that have been accentuated, and the additional work that you need to do. So this whole conversation around teacher shortages, assistant teacher shortages, people not wanting to be in the classroom anymore, I believe is alive and well, regardless of sector. There are also issues of, shortages of bus drivers and whatnot. So I think, first of all, we have to commend any and all educators right now, because what they're doing is all the more complicated because
100%, absolutely.
But in terms of what's ahead, we have demonstrated this for a while, but I think COVID and the pandemic definitely accentuated that the days of having a one-size-fits-all system that's all things to all people are gone. And we knew these systems did not work efficiently from an operations standpoint in certain inner cities, but a lot of individuals started to notice these in affluent suburbs, which is one of the suburbs where I live, for instance. So the fact that the public is now more focused on education and the need for options opens the door to discussions about charter schools, which is one of the best forms of public school choice. And I would also argue, if you really want to do choice, charters are the way to go. They have expanded, they have innovated, and they have also raised student achievement demonstrably over the years. But the other thing that we should also be aware of is, yes, there are some lessons in what we did, but how do we share this with the greater public? How do we transfer this information and learning to the larger public school system so that we are making the entire delivery system of public education work a lot better than it did before? And I think we have some opportunities to seize. In terms of what's ahead, though, there are some states like Virginia where the governor has pledged to open 20 charter schools. So we hope to hopefully amend the state's charter law to open those 20 schools. There are other states like New Mexico and New Hampshire. And other places where we're active in New York, as you know, New York City has hit a cap in the number of charters that can open. And now we have a governor who's supportive, but also a mayor now in New York City who is a big supporter of educational options. And so it's going to be interesting to see what movements we see in states like New York and in cities like New York City, which has hit some headwinds because Mayor de Blasio was such an opponent of charter schools. So I think we'll see additional momentum. This is a year where we have a lot of midterm elections, and usually when people are running for office, legislative activities slow down. But we suspect that a lot of the after this year, certainly the momentum will continue, but it's going to be incumbent on us as to what we do with it. So you can change policies and expand options so you have more students who are interested or have access to charter schools. But at the end of the day, what you really need are educators who are ready, willing, and able to go into these new communities to open schools. And we certainly have a lot of educators and a lot of leaders who are ready to do that. But one of the key lessons, certainly, that I've learned over time is the importance of having folks on the ground who are themselves opening those schools or partnering with someone who knows how to run a school, because ultimately all politics is local. And you want to make sure that these schools are run and operated by people who understand the communities that they serve.
Well, it's a perfect segue, Nina, to what's next. And here in South Carolina over the past couple of years, and you kind of mentioned it, that, you know, folks are leaving the education sector for one reason or another, but we've had a lot of turnover of new school leaders across our state. So for those that may not have a good understanding, share with us the role of the National Alliance and how your organization works with other organizations like the Association of Charter School Authorizers or state associations like ours to strengthen the charter school movement and to just strengthen charter schools in general.
Mm-hmm. That's a great question. So our organization was actually conceptualized in 2004, launched, I believe, around 2005, in order to be an alliance of state associations and resource centers and other partners. We're not a full-blown association, but we work in partnership with associations and resource centers throughout the country in order to lead the sector, but also serve the specific needs of the sector. So in that respect, we're not, we have relationships with authorizers, but we don't represent authorizers. The National Association of Charter School Authorizers does that. So right now we just, we focus a lot on our strategic plan. We have three main goals in our strategic plan. The first one is to keep an eye on all the federal rules and regulations that are being handed every day, so that those rules don't impede a charter school autonomy. When I was at the Department of Education and this organization was being launched, one of the key reasons different organizations were coming together to launch the National Alliance stemmed from the fact that at the time, No Child Left Behind had a regulation or a provision that would have mandated that all teachers be certified. And as you know, in the charter space, you want to have alternative routes to teacher certification. And that would have impeded, even though that administration was very charter friendly, what they were doing would have impeded the autonomy of charter schools. So keeping an eye on those rules and regulations is really important. We also advocate for additional funding at the federal level to support the growth of charter schools. After 30 years of chartering to this day, there is no money out there that allows for a new school to launch properly. As you know, when you first launch, you're not going to have any money until you have enough students and seats. So this federal funding called the Charter Schools Program gives you funds for up to 3 to 5 years to mitigate, the costs that are associated with running the school until you have enough per pupil allocations coming to your school with students. So the federal is kind of our key bread and butter, and one of the things that a lot of our state associations rely on us to handle. At the state level, we work in partnership with our state association partners, and so it depends again on what the state association is interested in and what the opportunities in the state are. And then more importantly, and sort of increasingly, one of the areas that we've focused on is communications, reshaping the narrative around charter schools, which really at the end of the day is really about promoting what a charter school is. So 30 years in the making, a lot of people still don't know that charters are public, that they don't charge a tuition, that they cannot teach religion. So these things continue to haunt us, especially because our opposition is constantly fueling the misinformation. And so we make sure that this information is out there in the public domain through different means and mechanisms, but also just to make sure that we're telling the story of charter schools through the lens of those who are operating them, the families who are attending them, the teachers who are teaching in them, and certainly the students and the alumni who are benefiting from them.
I want to go back just a second to something you mentioned just a bit ago, and that's about the autonomy of schools, that you guys work to protect the charter school autonomy. And I think it's important to note that I think when you hear that, if you're not directly involved with charter schools or have that much knowledge, you may think of just the educational side, and that is part of it. But again, that's just part of it. And I've heard you talk about before, it's not just the educational side, but it's also the operational side, where you have autonomy to make choices that are best serving your community, your school community.
No, I completely agree. And so again, most of these rules and regulations, unfortunately, stem from rules that come at the local level and at the state level. So the federal government is a little bit removed from it. But certainly when No Child Left Behind was conceptualized, it was really the first time that the federal government was taking a more aggressive role in setting certain standards and accountability systems in order to make sure Title I funds were used properly. And so that was the first time that the feds leaned in a lot more. So, but you are correct. So protecting charter school autonomies and freedoms to innovate is at the core of our grand bargain. And I would also argue that there are three things that really distinguish us from the traditional system. One is, of course, that we're schools of choice. Parents are selecting us. If enough of them don't come to our schools, we can't remain open. The second piece of it is this autonomy, which comes with everything you just mentioned about selecting curriculum, hiring teachers, paying them a fair wage and a differentiated pay structure so that you're able to, give a rock star teacher more money if they're doing a really good job, and keep them engaged in your school system. And also the autonomy really by these educators to come up with different ways of operating the school. Most of the teachers who started charter schools in the early days, and I would argue even to this day, were attracted to the charter setting because they couldn't do certain things in their district-run schools. In most of these large districts, the district sets the schedule. The district tells you when you have to open, when you have to close, what you have to teach, and all of that. So chartering is different. You can, come up with your own ways of doing these things, but you still have to administer the test, and you're then held accountable by your authorizer around whatever term you signed with them, centered around student achievement. So it's the ultimate and the best form of accountability, which is focused on results rather than inputs.
So let's talk about some of that current federal legislation, and specifically I want to talk about the House version that's the appropriations bill that not only sees cuts for the charter school program that you mentioned earlier, but also has some adverse language in Section 314 when it comes to funding for certain charter schools. First, if you would, give us an overview of that bill as it relates to charters, and then share with us where it stands today.
So just very quickly, I should just highlight that your delegation in Washington, all of the House members and certainly the senators are huge supporters of charter schools. And certainly yes. Senator Scott is not only a supporter of charter schools and the charter schools program, but all forms of choice. And in the House, Representative Wilson is a big supporter and leads our charter school program funding letter every year. He was one of our charter champs. They have both been given our charter champ award. And certainly Representative Clyburn, who's a leader and on the Democratic side, is also a supporter. So in terms of the provision,
thank you for that. I should have led in with that, but thank you for we do have a great congressional delegation, and they should be applauded. So I appreciate you bringing that up for sure. Thank you.
No, it's great because you want to make sure your elected officials are paying attention to these things, and
absolutely,
they're definitely paying attention and they're supported, which is great. So on the provisions that you mentioned, so every year the House produces an appropriations bill which articulates where they want to spend funds. And we have been asking for $500 million to be allocated for the charter schools program to increase the amount of money that's available to open new charter schools and take care of the needs of the facilities finance for charter schools. And so over the past few years, the amount of money that states have received has hovered at $440 million. Unfortunately, this year, Representative DeLauro from Connecticut, who chairs the subcommittee that oversees our budget, but also the full appropriations committee, shaved our appropriation by $40 million. She had done this twice before, and every time we went to her to find out why she was shaving our allocation, she would argue that, I wanted to use this as a negotiating tool when I'm negotiating something with the Senate at the time when President Trump was in office. She wanted to use this as a bargaining chip with a Republican administration and a Republican Senate. But this year was very different because Democrats control both chambers and the White House, and the White House's own budget also sets the allocation for the charter schools program at $440 million. So while every other program got an increase and a whole host of new programs were launched, she still managed to shave the charter schools program allocation by $40 million. But the other thing that she added to the final package was a provision that would have prohibited any federal funding to go to a school that had a contract with a for-profit organization. Her intent was to go after those organizations that are fully for-profit managing a charter school, but the way this language was written was vague enough that it raised a lot of red flags for us and everyone in our community who was observing the way this thing was written. And so we fought the provision in the House. Fortunately, the provision does not exist in the Senate. And they haven't negotiated a final bill, but we're watching that very carefully to go after. So as you know, this discussion around who manages a charter school and whether the management structure is far enough from the school in order for the school to be able to fire the management company if they're not offering services is definitely one of those issues that we pay a lot of attention to. But in this instance, the way this was written, it would have actually gone after all the families who had already made a choice to send their kids to these schools. And because the language was so vague, it would have put to question a contract that a school may have had with a food service company. Most of them are for-profit, with a bus company. Again, most of those are for-profit, textbook companies and whatnot. And so that is the danger of these types of efforts. And again, this was added at the last hour with no discussion whatsoever. So it took us by surprise, but the sector responded firmly. And, as I said, the fact the Senate did not include any of it is a positive sign.
Yes, definitely. So I think it's understood in our communities that the National Alliance and charter school leaders in organizations like the South Carolina Alliance, we all work to advocate for schools and students, and that's part of our jobs, right? But I think what a lot of messages that's going out now is educating teachers, families, how they can best advocate and support their schools and why it's so important for them to do so. So what advice would you have for those families or for those teachers that are in charter schools on advocating for themselves, for their schools, for their students?
Mm-hmm. That's a great question. And I mean, you just articulated the importance. I mean, these individuals are at the front lines. They are the ones who know the most about what a charter is and how it works. And so their own stories, the reason they got attracted to this school model is important, but also the beneficiaries of charter schools, the families, the students, those individuals need to be the ones talking about it. As with anything, those who are benefiting from something are the ones who can sell the product much better than anyone else. They
know best, right?
Absolutely. And so one of the school leaders we recently featured in a document called 30 Under 30. These are individuals who are under the age of 30, who have done tremendous work in serving their communities. Callan Rogers, who is
Yes.
27. Last year he was 27. He's an alumni and a principal at Calhoun Falls Charter High School in Calhoun Falls, South Carolina. So he not only graduated from his charter school, he's back as a principal, but he also serves in whatever capacity the school needs, whether it's a bus driver, whether it's a coach, whether it's a teacher.
Tremendous story.
Yeah, so we are proud to have examples like Callan's, but you have so many in your state. I mean, we just captured one because he submitted an application and whatnot. But I think every state association should not only have a bank of stories, but also pull those who are interested in telling their stories more aggressively, so that we are talking about charter schools through the lens of those who are running them and being served by them. They are ultimately the ones who also can shape the future of the movement better than anyone else.
Well, Nina, I can't thank you enough for joining SC Charter Chatter today. Really appreciate your insight, really appreciate your thoughts, and all of your knowledge there. Before we wrap up, I'd be remiss if I didn't at least mention the National Charter Schools Conference coming up in June, right?
Absolutely. Thank you for bringing that up. If you have not registered, we encourage you to go online and register for the conference. Our website is at publiccharters.org, and you'll be able to click on the link to take you to the website. It's in Washington, D.C. It is going to be in person, June 20th through the 23rd at the Convention Center. And it's a great, place to talk about the latest trends impacting our movement, but also to reconnect with individuals who've been in the movement a long time and, re-energize. You all have a conference too, these jobs can be kind of lonely. So
very siloed at times, for sure. Absolutely.
Yeah. So hopefully
and this
your sector will show.
Going to be in person, like you mentioned, for the first time since 2019, right?
Yes.
2 years of virtual conferences. Trust me, those are more difficult. Absolutely. We've done a couple of those here. So it's a lot of work doing virtual. I know you're excited to be back in person.
Absolutely. Yeah.
Well, Nina, thank you again for joining us on SC Charter Chatter. Really appreciate your time, and I can't thank you enough.
Thank you so much for having me.
That wraps up episode 12 of SC Charter Chatter. My thanks again to Nina Rees and the National Alliance for Public Charter Schools for the work they do to help us support you and all of the charter schools in our state. Remember, you can join the National Alliance at this year's National Charter Schools Conference. It will be June 19th through the 22nd in Washington, D.C. Learn more about the conference and register at publiccharterschools.org. We hope to see you there. As always, thanks for listening and the all-around support. Be sure to follow us or subscribe, and don't forget to leave us a 5-star review. Let us know what you think of the show. Our email is podcast@scharterschools.org. You can also share topics or ideas for the show. Again, podcast@scharterschools.org. Like us on Facebook and Instagram at SC Charter Schools, on Twitter, SC Charter School, and remember to use the hashtag MyCharterSC. Until next time, I'm Kevin. The information, opinions, and recommendations presented on this podcast are for general information only, and no person should act or refrain from acting on the basis of the content of this podcast without first seeking appropriate professional advice. The views and opinions expressed on this podcast are those of the individuals and do not necessarily reflect the official policy or position of the Public Charter Schools Alliance, and their appearance on the program does not imply an endorsement of them or any other entity they represent. Information and material in this episode will not be updated and may not be current. Please consult your own professional for any advice for your specific situation. To read the full disclaimer, go to scharterschools.org.